And you are still watching Lunch Money right here on BTVI. The U.S. President Donald Trump continues to keep the markets on edge. His latest attacks in terms of adding more impositions on China have clouded over the Asian markets as well as others. Now, with more countries announcing that they will retaliate with tariffs, the question really investors have is whether this is an all-out war that will leave no player unscathed or the beginning of a new world order in the global arena. To decode Trump's brinkmanship, joining us now in the studio is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's a professor and dean at Jindal School of International Affairs. Dr. Chaulia, wonderful to have you right here with me in the studio. We've been, of course, looking at all of this in terms of the markets and how they seem to be playing out. There's a bit of nervousness that's coming into the stock markets, but I want to get that jargon away from things and really ask you, what is finally going to happen here? And very quickly, before we get into the details, the latest we've seen in terms of retaliatory tariffs, in terms of what India has actually said, how is that going to actually affect, or will it affect, the India-US strategic partnership, so to speak?
Fatima, I think we are on the edge of the precipice. The trade war, full-blown trade war, has not yet begun, but certainly the kind of bad sentiments that are circulating do suggest that this is in some kind of a retaliatory spiral, because national interests are at stake, and especially the Chinese, the EU, and Canada and Mexico, the NAFTA partners. These are the three big elements of US trade, the three big pillars, and all three of them are hitting back. So what it means is, like, Trump, because he has taken this economic warfare position, he has staked out this America first and nationalistic line, which is contrary to the principles of globalization. There are a lot of countries that are going to be forced to respond in kind, which means that the overall system of globalization, which has driven global trade and which has driven prosperity for the last 20-25 years, is now in jeopardy. And indeed, if he goes ahead and implements $200 billion worth of new goods imports from China, if they're under pressure for tariffs, US tariffs, the Chinese will be forced to also hit back. So I think we are in a kind of a race to the bottom, and that's not good. As far as India goes, I think we are a smaller player, relatively speaking. Our deficit with the United States, trade deficit, the one that rankles Trump the most, is hardly 25 to 30 billion. And the Chinese, we're talking about volume 350 billion or more. The Germans much higher than India. So I think we may not get the same kind of stick in terms of the impact as these bigger players do. But definitely we have responded because we had to, in terms of the WTO rules and rights that we have. $240 million is not a huge sum. It's like a drop in the ocean, because overall US-India trade is 100 billion. So 240 million, it's almost like a starting point where we are saying, let's not make this uglier, and let's try and sort it out through negotiations. Suresh Prabhu has been there. I think he's talking about some kind of a bilateral deal with the US. But the interesting thing about Trump is, on this matter, he's a hardliner, because he's a populist and he believes that trade deficits are bad and that America is being cheated. So he's not going to compromise so much on this. So where will it all end, as you began? I think we are in for a nasty kind of 2 to 3 years, until especially the November congressional elections, because Trump wants to prove to his domestic constituency that, I promise that I'll protect American.
So there is a lot of rhetoric. One would imagine, Professor, that there is a lot of rhetoric going around over here, and I want to ask you about that as well, whether actually something substantial can happen out of this, or are we just going to be stuck in rhetoric? Professor Chaulia, I want to ask you, DEA Secretary, of course, talking very positively about all that remains, especially in the digital age and what India can bring to the table. But even as we speak about this and global trade war jitters, how real are they, and how India is placed? For the longest time, we thought we were pretty insulated because the domestic market is so strong. Not so much right now. So how do you think India is actually going to get impacted if this rhetoric actually becomes as real as the jitters that we are feeling in the markets around the world seem to suggest?
Well, the Make in India premise is that we will be able to manufacture and export to major global centers, including the United States. But if the US becomes more and more protectionist, and the spiral that we talked about leads to more protectionism and walls being erected all over the world, it's going to definitely impact our export targets in the coming years. And secondly, I think investment is going to be dragged in, because if the Chinese start restricting US businesses in mainland China, as another kind of a punishment for Trump's unruly behavior, then we are going to see a situation where Trump will want most of the big Western investors to come back and manufacture in America. And that's not good news for us, because it will mean outflow of capital funds from our own economic cycle here. So I think we've got to be watchful to how far this goes. Somebody must drive sense into the populists who are waging this economic warfare. But I think the retaliation is proportional. I think it is reasonable. It is low profile. India is not trying to be unreasonable at all by going overboard. And I think we are trying to keep this under control. But it remains to be seen, because the ideology driving this is far bigger than one-on-one transactions between the US and India. I think it's a far bigger issue which has to do with the failure of globalization, the perceived failure of globalization in the US itself.
Sure. Just very quickly, because we're running out of time, Dr. Chaulia, I just need to ask you, whether ultimately who is going to be paying for these kind of policies? Because at the end of the day, there's of course a fear that it's consumers, maybe perhaps even in America, that are going to get affected quite strongly, as I guess other economies as well. But who really actually pays for the economics of conflict?
Fatima, consumers worldwide, producers who depend on imported products as components, and definitely the biggest loser will be international peace and stability, the WTO system, the rules-based order. That is at stake. And we are not going to be coming out of this unscathed, because at the end of the day, we need some kind of a regulatory system for the multilateral order. And if the WTO is bypassed like this, the way Trump is doing, and going unilateral, as we have pointed out in our response, I think it's bad for a rules-based international order.
All right. Dr. Chaulia, a pleasure having you in our studios, really giving us a sense as to how this is really supposed to be decoded, both on a political as well as an economic level. Thank you for that.